The year was 1928, and the streets of Harlem were charged with a tension that could only be cut by the crack of a gunshot. The city had never known a time like this, a time when power and loyalty were constantly being tested, where men who once thought they ruled their empires were now facing threats from all sides. The usual hustle of the night had given way to an uneasy calm. Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's kingpin, sat in his office, the dim light of a single lamp casting shadows across the walls, his face unreadable as he stared down at the map of Harlem that lay before him. This map wasn't just a representation of the city, it was a blueprint of his kingdom. Every street, every corner, every bar and speakeasy was part of his territory. But as Bumpy traced his fingers over the lines and symbols, he could feel the pressure mounting. Harlem was no longer the safe haven it once was. The Italians, led by the infamous Joe Adonis, had begun eyeing his turf. They were making moves, quietly, carefully, and Bumpy knew that sooner or later they would make their play. And when they did, it wouldn't be a polite business transaction. It would be war. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Tony, one of his most trusted lieutenants, his face grim. "It's time, Bumpy," Tony said, stepping into the room. His voice was low, tense, as if the very air around them had grown thick with anticipation. Bumpy stood up, his movements measured, calm, as if the weight of the situation hadn't settled on his shoulders. He wasn't just the boss of Harlem, he was its protector, its guardian. And tonight, he was going to show every gangster, every rival, and every street soldier that no one, not even the Italians, was going to take what was his. "Let's go," Bumpy said, his voice steady. "Tonight, we make a statement. Harlem doesn't belong to anyone but me." As Bumpy stepped out of his office, he could feel the eyes of his men on him. The moment had arrived. They had all heard the rumors, the whispers that the Mafia was making its move. But now, they were about to see just how far Bumpy Johnson was willing to go to protect his kingdom. The streets of Harlem, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, felt like a different world. The usual noise of laughter, music, and the shuffle of feet had been replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the most hardened criminals knew that something was brewing, something that would decide the future of Harlem. Bumpy's crew, tight-knit and ready for whatever came, moved through the streets with purpose. Their footsteps echoed on the pavement as they approached the meeting spot, an old warehouse near the docks. Bumpy had arranged the confrontation with Joe Adonis himself. This wasn't just a message to the Italians, it was a message to everyone who thought they could challenge his rule. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with tension. Joe Adonis, a cold, calculating figure with a reputation that stretched far beyond New York, stood with his men, his eyes narrowed as Bumpy entered the room. The two men locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. "You think you can just walk into my city, take what's mine, and leave without any consequences?" Bumpy's voice cut through the silence, filled with authority and calm fury. Adonis, his face expressionless, stepped forward. "Harlem's a prize, Bumpy, and Capone's making his move. You've got two choices. Join us or get out of the way." Bumpy's lips curled into a half smile. The only way I'm getting out of the way is in a coffin, and that's not going to happen tonight. The room seemed to freeze, every man waiting for the first move. But Bumpy wasn't one to wait for things to unfold. He had already made his decision. This was no negotiation. This was a war for Harlem.
"Tony,"
Bumpy said, never taking his eyes off Adonis. "Get the men ready." Tony nodded, and in an instant, the warehouse erupted into chaos. Bumpy's crew sprang into action, confronting the Italians with the brutal precision that Bumpy had trained them in. It wasn't just about fists and guns. It was about showing dominance, about showing that Harlem was his, and anyone who thought they could take it would pay the price. As the fight raged on, Bumpy made his way to Adonis. The two men finally met face to face, a battle of wills in the midst of the chaos. Adonis drew a knife, his hand shaking slightly as he lunged at Bumpy. But Bumpy was faster. He grabbed Adonis's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. "I told you," Bumpy growled, his grip like iron. "Harlem is mine, and no one, not you, not Capone, will ever take it from me." With a swift motion, Bumpy slammed Adonis against the wall, his fist crashing into the mobster's jaw with a sound that echoed through the warehouse. Adonis crumpled to the ground, his men backing off as they realized the power of Bumpy Johnson was not something they could fight. It wasn't just muscle, it was the will to win, the unbreakable spirit of a man who had fought and bled for every inch of his territory. Bumpy stood over Adonis, breathing heavily, his face inches from the fallen man's. "Tell Capone this. Harlem belongs to Bumpy Johnson, and it always will." Bumpy Johnson's rise to power wasn't a fairy tale. It was a story of survival. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, Bumpy learned early on that life was about taking what you needed and holding on to it with everything you had. At the age of 16, he was already making his way through the criminal world, learning the ropes in the gritty streets of New York. But it wasn't until he landed in Harlem that he found his true calling. Harlem, in the 1920s, was a land of opportunity, but also of danger. It was a neighborhood that had seen its fair share of violence and corruption, and the gangsters who ruled the streets were a breed apart. In those early years, Bumpy quickly made a name for himself in the numbers racket, which was one of Harlem's most lucrative industries. He wasn't just another criminal, he was a businessman, a strategist, and most importantly, a survivor. By the late 1920s, Bumpy had earned a reputation as one of Harlem's most feared and respected figures. His empire spanned from the numbers game to bootlegging to various gambling operations. He controlled the streets, and his influence reached far beyond the local gangs. He had connections in high places, politicians, police officers, even influential businessmen. He understood the importance of keeping the peace with the powers that be, and as a result, Harlem flourished under his rule. But while Bumpy had made a name for himself as a businessman, he had also made enemies, many of them. Rival gangs, other crime lords, and the ever-present threat of the Mafia, with its ties to men like Al Capone, were constant reminders that power in Harlem was never guaranteed. Bumpy had survived because he understood the one unbreakable rule: loyalty. His men, his crew, they weren't just workers, they were his family, and loyalty meant everything in Harlem's cutthroat world. But in 1928, that loyalty was about to be tested. The Italians, led by the ambitious Joe Adonis, had begun to move into Harlem, seeking to claim the territory that Bumpy had fought so hard to build. They had money, muscle, and the backing of Capone's organization. But Bumpy wasn't going to let them take what was his, not without a fight. The challenge came not just from the Mafia, it came from within Bumpy's own ranks. The younger men, eager to rise to power and take what they saw as a bigger share of the pie, were beginning to question Bumpy's leadership. They had seen the influx of new blood into Harlem, the arrival of the Italians, and they wondered if Bumpy still had what it took to lead them to victory. Bumpy, however, saw through the doubts. He knew that power wasn't just about money or muscle, it was about respect. And respect wasn't something that could be bought or traded, it had to be earned. That was why he was prepared to fight, not just against the Mafia, but against the rising tide of discontent within his own crew. If he didn't act, if he didn't reassert his dominance, his empire would begin to crumble. He had already begun to make his move, calling in favors from old contacts, consolidating his hold over the businesses and street corners that made up his empire. But there was one final battle he needed to win, the one with the Italians. They had crossed the line, and Bumpy wasn't going to let them walk away from it. The night had arrived. The shadows of the old warehouses on the docks seemed to stretch farther than usual, as if they were silently waiting for the inevitable. Bumpy Johnson, standing tall at the head of his men, knew that this moment would define him, either as the man who had held Harlem or as the man who had watched it slip away. The air was thick with anticipation. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long, eerie shadows on the wet pavement. The sound of Bumpy's boots on the cobblestone echoed like a drumbeat, a steady rhythm that punctuated the silence of the night. His men followed closely behind, every one of them ready to back their boss in whatever came next. Loyalty ran deep in this crew, and Bumpy knew that tonight would either strengthen or break that bond. The streets would decide. As they neared the abandoned warehouse, the entrance loomed ahead like the mouth of a cave, dark, imposing, and silent. Bumpy's thoughts briefly flickered to the men inside, most of them Mafia soldiers, but one man in particular weighed heavily on his mind: Joe Adonis. Bumpy had met him several times before, but always in the shadows, always in negotiations. This time, there would be no words. This time, the law of the streets would speak for itself. Bumpy stopped in front of the door. He gave a small nod, and his men moved into position. The door creaked open, and they entered, the harsh light from the street lamp outside briefly illuminating the warehouse's interior before it fell into darkness again. The air smelled of damp wood and stale alcohol, an old, abandoned world that was about to witness the changing of its power. The moment Bumpy and his crew stepped inside, the tension could be cut with a knife. Adonis, standing with several of his men, turned slowly. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto Bumpy's. There was no pretense here, just raw, unfiltered power. "You've got some nerve, Bumpy," Adonis said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "This is my city now. Capone's made it clear, either you're with us or you're against us. Bumpy's lips curled into a small smile, his gaze unwavering. Capone might control Chicago, but he doesn't control Harlem. This is my turf, Adonis, and it'll stay that way no matter how many men you send. There was a brief silence, the weight of Bumpy's words hanging in the air. It was the calm before the storm. Adonis chuckled darkly, stepping closer to Bumpy. You really think you can take me on, Bumpy? You've got guts, I'll give you that. But in the end, it's all about muscle. And I've got more muscle than you can handle. Bumpy didn't flinch. Muscle's one thing, but respect? That's earned. His voice dropped low, heavy with meaning. And you, Joe, are about to learn how much respect I've earned. With a swift motion, Bumpy drew his gun. The loud bang of a single shot rang through the warehouse, striking the floor just inches from Adonis's feet. The Mafia soldiers jumped into action, reaching for their weapons, but Bumpy's men were quicker. The sound of gunfire erupted in a violent, chaotic symphony as the two sides collided. Bumpy moved with precision, his body coiled with the energy of years of surviving in the streets. Every motion was calculated, every decision part of a larger strategy to send a message. Not just to Adonis and the Mafia, but to every street thug who had ever doubted his ability to protect what was his. Adonis scrambled backward, his eyes wide with fear. Bumpy approached him slowly, the barrel of his gun pointing directly at his chest. Adonis knew this was the end. He had underestimated the man he had thought he could push around. But Bumpy wasn't just any gangster. He was the man who had shaped the streets of Harlem with his bare hands. "Last chance, Joe," Bumpy said, his voice calm but edged with a quiet fury. "Leave Harlem, and you walk out of here alive. Try to take what's mine, and you won't leave here at all." Adonis, blood dripping from a shallow wound on his arm, stood there, breathing heavily. For a moment, the room fell silent as the gravity of Bumpy's words sank in. But Adonis wasn't ready to give up. His pride, his empire, everything was on the line. With a swift movement, he lunged forward, trying to take Bumpy down with a desperate swipe of his knife. Bumpy was faster. He sidestepped the attack, grabbed Adonis by the wrist, and with a brutal twist, disarmed him. The knife clattered to the floor, and in one final, decisive motion, Bumpy shoved the barrel of his gun against Adonis's chest. "Your move?" Adonis, realizing the battle was lost, raised his hands in surrender. "You win, Bumpy. Harlem's yours, but this isn't over. You know that, right?" Bumpy's eyes hardened. "It's over for you," he said quietly. "Capone won't be able to save you. Get out of my city." With that, Bumpy motioned to his men, who quickly subdued the remaining Mafia soldiers. Adonis was left standing, a broken man in the center of a battlefield, his empire crumbling around him. In the aftermath, the streets of Harlem buzzed with a new energy. Word spread quickly that Bumpy Johnson had defeated the Mafia, repelled their invasion, and cemented his rule once again. The Italians had learned the hard way that Harlem was Bumpy's. No one could take it from him. The community responded with a mixture of awe and reverence. The businesses